Let's compare all M4 generation MacBook Pro from M4, M4 Pro, and M4 Max in all the SoC variation in a pro photo and video workflow to determine which one is best suited for your workflow and also your budget. Because when we take a look at this entire range, we are also looking at a price delta of $2,400. So let's determine which one is going to be the sweet spot in all of this. Let's jump right in. I'm ArtIsRight. This video is an encore. All the testing data for this generation M4 has already been released with my M4 Max comparison video. However, I'm relooking at some of these machines in a slightly different way so that we can highlight certain machines a little differently. So if you want to learn more about this one, let's jump right in. As usual, I'll be sharing lots of information. Please pause the video so you can analyze the result yourself, in addition to the analysis I'll be sharing with you. This channel is fully self-funded. If you find information helpful, a membership, YouTube Super Thanks work. I'll also leave a link to my tip jar in the description. And if the only thing that you can do is subscribe if you haven't already, and tapping on that like button, this way YouTube algorithm will push this to an even larger audience, I would greatly appreciate that, and it works equally as well. Now, if you do find information helpful though, if you can help me share this video with 3 other creatives, this way they can learn about all of these and choose the right machine for their workflow too, that would be even more fantastic. And lastly, if you find any mistakes or have a question or something like that, just be kind in the comments, please, because I am a one-person channel. With that said, we are going to take a look at all of these machines. These are the stock configuration for this generation. And a few things that I do want to point out is that if you, for instance, upgrade to the top silicon on this one or on this one, usually if you go in and just really bump up the silicon itself, you're going to see very little performance on those. Another thing that I will also say in my previous video, if you haven't watched that yet, link will be in the description. But when we compare the M4 Pro top versus the M4 Max base, the result really surprised us, because if we take a look at the stock configuration right now, it's $1,000 price difference, and most of the time, the gain we're getting on this Max base is usually only a few minutes. And on most of the tests, we're talking about less than 3 minutes. Something interesting to consider there. Now, with all these, we're really going up in terms of the SoCs, so we're having more CPUs. Do note that between these two, they have the same amount of CPU. That is the Top Pro versus the Base Max. And the rest have just increasing amount of GPU as we really go throughout the system, increasing amount of memory, and also SSD for the stock configuration too. The one that I got, this is also considered stock. However, you can really get the base one in 256, which I think is really not enough for any type of pro workflow. Lastly, I want to point this out to this memory bandwidth number, and what I'm going to say is that it really doesn't matter. Don't consider getting the silicon, or the generation for that matter, or the family of silicon based on that number, because there is no app in photo and video today that can really go in and saturate that bandwidth. And you may argue, like, what about in the future? I'm like, okay, let's be honest about something. Since the M1 generation, we haven't seen an app that can really go in and utilize that. I think we're still more than a few years away before we have an app that can go in and saturate CPU, GPU, NPU, and also memory at the very same time. Not to mention, a lot of apps are not really running the processes on the GPU or on the NPU because there are color artifacting that comes from that. Interesting, right? All right, when we take a look at the base 14-inch one with the M4 to the top M4 Max, we're taking a look at a price delta of $2,400 across the lineup. Now, you really have to ask yourself, which one are you going to buy that's going to be the sweet spot that will give you the best performance? I think I already have an answer in mind, but take a guess right now and see in the end if you agree or not, and if your answer is correct. All right, with that in mind, we're going to also be adding result from the M1 to the M3 Max, the Pros, the regular ones. You'll also see the 2 Mac Studio, Mac Mini this generation, and going back all the way to the M1 generation in the compilation chart, and a PC. This is the Alienware M18R1. Configuration and buyer guides will be at the end. Now, one thing that I will mention about this is in Apple Silicon, there's always this segmentation, more consumer leaning, and the Pro. If you're doing this for revenue, I definitely recommend getting the Pro, Max, or Ultra with the name attached to it, because it's a more well-rounded SoC, and it's going to save you a lot more time in the long run. So that's what I have to say. Now, if you're a hobbyist, definitely you can go with the M's. That's going to be just fine. And also, I'm going to say this. There are some that have asked me to do a comparison between the Intel to the current generation. I mean, let's be honest, at this point, there's really no comparison. If you want to see how the Intel Mac would perform against an Apple Silicon, starting with M1 generation, I would definitely recommend that you go back and watch my M1 generation video, because at that point, the M1 chips, it's pretty much already smoking Intel right out of the water. The only tasks where it can't do certain things really well are things that wasn't really optimized. And reminder, those were the tasks that were running on Rosetta 2. They were running on the translation layer. It wasn't even running on the native application at that point in time. All right, upgrade priority, my recommendation is to choose the amount of memory first, and then from there, once you really know how much memory you need, then look at the chip family. This would be, for example, going from the regular to the Pro to the Max, etc. Storage size, and then the variants within that chip family. Whether you want to add GPU or CPU to that or not, to go up to, like, for example, the top M4 Pro. Generally, I don't recommend doing this because you're not going to see that much performance per dollar. Then upgrading memory, you're going to see a lot more for that. Nano texture display is something that I definitely love. I wish I had this that much longer. And yes, with nano texture display, you can still see accurate and good colors. The perception of it is different, but I will also say that nano texture display is giving you a more honest assessment of how your editing is and how your work is. Because if you can get something looking good on a nano texture, they're always going to look good on a glossy. However, if you get something looking good on a glossy, most of the time when you bring it to a matte display, it kind of looks dull. That's because you're only taking your work 60% of the way there. I'll have another video talking about all this a little bit later on. I'll try to have that soon because I know many of you want to see it, but that's just my initial thought on that one, but I absolutely love that. Calibration passed from the M4, M4 Pro, M4 Max using ArtIsRight software, and also hardware calibration with BenQ Palette Master Ultimate. So no problem, we can get good color on day one. My recommendation for these is to set them up as a new machine, especially if you're coming from an Intel generation, because you do not want to bring the Intel binary over. And if you want to see a video on how I set up my machine for a pro workflow, do leave them in the comments. I might do a video for that. I mean, it's hard to find time right now, but I will make it a point to do so. Here's how you read the spec. And one more thing that I do want to mention is that I've been getting requests for the M4 Pro 48 gigabytes in the MacBook Pro configuration. I'm not going to order any machines into Studio to do any more testing. However, if you're in Southern California area and you want to have me borrow your machine for, I would probably say like 3 or 4 hours, we can meet up somewhere. I can just run the test. Do feel free to reach out. Do feel free to DM me. I think that's going to be the best way to do it. All right. SSD. Remember that whatever you configure with SSD itself, you can always expand it by plugging in an external drive, an SSD, a NAS, a DAS, and so forth. And the speed on all these are generally going to just be enough right now for what you really need. So most of them are going to be, especially in the M4 generation, which are down at the bottom, are going to be in around like the 5,000, 6,000 range, although the write might be a little bit slower on the Pro compared to the Max. That's because it has less NAND chip in there, but the read itself is actually mighty fast. We're going to see some of that resulting in Photoshop when it's doing a lot of swap, and I'll point it out later on. As far as how fast of an SSD you need, I made a video talking about it. I'll leave a link in the description. You want to check that out. All right, RAM. When it comes to this, you really need to consider use case and modality. My main rule of thumb about RAM is, for instance, if your current machine have 32, like on an Intel, don't go down to 16, don't go down to like 24, keep the same thing, if not more on your system. That would be the first rule of thumb I can tell you. If you're really unsure about how much RAM you need on the system, and you're already on a Mac, one thing you can definitely do is restart your machine. This way you have a fresh memory, and what you can do is launch Activity Monitor, go into the memory tab, and monitor the memory pressure as you go through your day with the creative apps you're using. If you're green, the amount of memory that you currently have is good, and you can probably go with that. If you're in the yellow or red, definitely consider getting more. And one of the programs I absolutely love is iStat Menu 7, not sponsored by them, but you can really go in and take a look at the multiple different stats from your machine going back up to like 28 days. So it actually holds the data for that long. You can really see your machine usage and utilization. I'm also super happy that Apple increased the base amount of RAM to 16 gigabytes now. And this is more relevant because we are talking about the M4. When I'm testing these, by the way, the power is set to auto because in the Pro and also the Max now, but also the Pro, most significantly, you can set it to high power. Although based on my testing so far, the performance between the apps and everything, we don't really see that huge of a jump. We just see the fan jumping up higher on those. All right, all the M4 are tested in 15.1. All the previous generation is tested in 15.0.1 Sequoia, but the timing between those are within the margin of error, and I am going forward with that. The other thing that I will also say is that I've also noticed a slowing down trend over time, that given the same machine, but the newer OS with the newer app becoming more demanding, machine tends to slow down a lot more over time. So that's just something to think about. All right, let's take a look at the result from Lightroom Classic. Comparing all these 5 machines in the lineup, we do see a couple of things. This is playing out exactly the way how we would expect it. CPU-based tasks, top machines performing at the top. The next one is coming down a little bit, and the M4 Pro. I mean, if you take a look at these ones right here, 19 seconds variation. This accounts for 19 seconds, and this is a $1,000 price variation. When we take a look at between these two, you're seeing some time variation between those two, but they're fairly small. This really accounts itself to around a $500 price variation. And this is where you really start to take a look at this and determine, wow, am I really getting that much value from these if the improvement are so marginally small compared to the money I'm actually putting in for these machines, right? Configuring the right machine. Now, when we take a look at the 14 MacBook Pro, M4 Pro, timing does increase a little bit, where I can see jumping between that, and mind you, this is also a 16-inch. Jumping between those may make a little bit more sense. For upgrading silicon, you might see the performance improvement, but otherwise, I wouldn't say, you know, you're going to see that much of a variation. M4 is coming behind. This is part of the reason why I don't recommend any of these if you're doing work for revenue, because they are not all around well-performing SoCs. All right. Lightroom Classic with all the rest right there. And let's take a look at Export. As we would have expected, a few minutes faster than the other, is cascading, as we can see there. And I still think at this price point, this machine is a good performer, because if we round this up to around 12, round this up to about 15, we're taking a look at around 3 minutes variation right there. So 3 minutes, right? Remember, we're taking a look at 1K price variation. This one, when we take a look at this two, 10 to 12, we're taking a look at a 2-minute variation for around 500, right? These are things that we need to really consider, and you're going to see these numbers repeat throughout that. Yeah, there are improvement, but I mean, this is not half by any means. And if the top spec was performing half of like everything else, like just like around right there where I marked that, I'd be like, yeah, absolutely. I would love to spend that kind of money to get, you know, the best performing speed on the road. Here's the rest of the other machines in the lineup. Now let's do an HDR merge. For this, the most part you're going to see is a second or two apart, and this is what I would say is within the margin of error. In fact, I didn't even arrange them by the top performance machine, because they are pretty much equally just about the same, and these two, they're not that much further behind. Here's the rest of the machine in the lineup. We do see a couple of trends, is that the M4 generation tends to be faster, followed by around like the M3, M2, and M1s as you start to see that cascading down. And we also have the X18 at the very end there, because this is single core, and X18, that AMD does not do well when it comes to single core tasks. Lightroom Classic Panorama Merge. Now let's take a look at this one. Interesting enough, there's a bug in Lightroom Classic Panorama Merge, like module components in the program, because the 14-inch MacBook Pro M4 with 16 gigabytes of memory was not able to finish this task, and there's many more machines that is not able to finish it. So what I have done instead is put in the result from the Mac Mini M4 16 gigabyte machine in as a reference, so we can see how they kind of would cascade. But this is the only exception that I'm putting the result in there, so that we get some ideas as to if it was functioning properly, this may be something that we could expect how it would perform. Now, when we take a look at these, we're talking about price variation again, panorama merge. This all have increasing amount of memory, and it makes sense. The more memory you have, the faster this task runs. But when we take a look at these two, we're talking about 33 seconds for $500. We're talking about like 40 seconds right there for $1,000. I don't know at this point anymore. So I'm thinking at this point in time, the 16-inch M4 Pro, the top M4 Pro, is really a good contender when it comes to a task like this. Here's the rest of the other machine in lineup. As I have pointed out, a whole bunch of the 16 gigabyte machine could not finish the task. The only two 16 gigabyte was the Mac Mini M4 and the 14-inch MacBook Pro M3, as I have pointed out on the chart. One more thing that I do want to mention about this is that the MacBook Pro M3 is taking way longer. Most of the other ones should be around in like the 4-minute range. So again, something wonky is going on there. Lightroom Classic AI Noise Reduction. For this, we're taking a look at one single image. This is a GPU-based task. And with this, when we give it more GPU, it's definitely going to run that much faster. But we're talking about slight variation, 3 seconds. For this one, we're talking about 7 seconds variation. For this one, we're talking like about what? 5 seconds variation. So we're not seeing that much variation yet. We're seeing the time increase quite a bit on the M4. This is part of the reason why I'm not really a big fan of the vanilla SoC. However, if I throw in an Intel in there, the vanilla M4 is going to perform really well compared to those machines. Everything is all about like relativity, right? So is relative to what are we really talking about here? AI noise reduction for the rest of the other machine in the lineup. And because doing noise reduction to one file is never enough, so I'm also doing noise reduction to 10 variety of raw files, as you can see. And when we run this task, the numbers, what we're really getting right now, makes sense in terms of the machine performance. But when we start to take a look at this, we are starting to jump a lot in price range, right? When we take a look at the two Mac Silicon, the top versus the base, we're talking about in the seconds. Half a minute or so in terms of performance improvement. We're talking about 1.5 minutes going from the base Max to the top M4 Pro. And do remember, this really accounts for $1,000 based on the machine configuration that I'm using here. When we jump between these two, it makes a little bit more sense. And yeah, there are some price increases between those two, like $200 price variation. I think that that probably would be the one that makes the most sense if I would have jumped. That's probably what I would do. And this is the machine that's definitely kind of winning out for me. And lastly, here's the result from the M4. We'll take a look at the rest of the machine in the lineup. Feel free to pause this. And let's now take a look at Lightroom Classic, AI Sky, and Subject Mask. So what I've done is work on one file to treat that as a master file. With that, I've gone in and select the sky, made some adjustments, select the subject, made an adjustment, and then Shift Command S, check all, and then sync them across and time it how long it's going to take, because Lightroom is really going to use AI to really detect the subject in the other scenes that I have. Timing are pretty much almost identical between all of these. These 10 files are definitely not the best test this time around, so I'll probably revise this for the next version, M5 Silicon, which may be in about like a year or something like that. We'll see. All right, let's take a look at Lightroom Desktop. For this, exporting 1,000 files, CPU, GPU, and RAM based together. Interestingly enough, I'm super surprised that the M4 Pro is coming out slightly ahead of the M4 Max. This is the top M4 Pro, this is the base M4 Max, and is faster by around 8 seconds in this particular task. This is the M4 Max right there, and this is the M4 Pro 14-inch, and when it comes to just the regular M4, it's really taking that much longer. That's part of the reason why we're not looking at as much, but this right here, I would say, is a very surprising machine. However, all these three are performing within a margin of error of each other. Here's the rest of the machine for comparison. And now let's take a look at Capture One. With this, we can see that the max performance are pretty much the same, despite one's costing $500 more. We can maybe slow down machine by around 43 seconds and save $1,000. Right? Interesting there. But then you start to see a little bit more of a gain. This scales in a way that makes sense. Capture One import, I am going to commend this by saying that they have ramped this up and they have made their import fast, which is what I like. This is also a large preview. I wish Lightroom Classic was this good, or I wish Lightroom Classic was more like Lightroom. That's my personal opinion. Here's the rest of the other machine I line up, but this next thing is where Capture One really start to fall apart, and here it is. We're adding more GPU core. This is a GPU-based task. We're not seeing that huge an improvement. A minute for 8 more GPU cores. Definitely not worth it. What about this one? Adding more cores. Timing is fairly close, just like about maybe like a minute apart or so, a little bit less than a minute. And when we look at the top M4 Pro versus the base M4 Max, we are looking around a 3-minute variation for $1,000. Those are things, again, to really think about. And you can see the M4 is really just trailing behind on all those tasks, which is why if you're working with large quantity of images, it doesn't make sense to get the regular M. Now, if you're just a hobbyist, I think the regular M's are going to be just fine. So really think about where you are in your creative workflow, in your creative journey, in your creative career when you're making this decision, in addition to my comment too, because I'm going to bias. I'm a pro and I need fast machine. That's what I'm going to do. All right, Photoshop. I am using Lloyd Chamber Digital Lloyd Test. These are the 3 I am using on this one, and I'm just running a test with 90% RAM allocation. Timing between all these are pretty much identical to each other. One may be slightly faster than each other, but most of the time, these are milliseconds. We can't really tell them apart as human beings. The timing for the rest of the machine, I mean, it doesn't really show that much of a speed degradation, maybe about a second or two. And all these tasks, not too bad. But when we start to take a look at Photoshop Medium, this is where we see a couple of variables at play. Number one, when we start to take a look at the amount of memory in the system, it's starting to make a difference. So what is this telling us? I mean, if you're constantly working with large files, maybe getting more RAM on the system, you're going to see the benefit of that. As far as these two go, timing are pretty much almost identical to each other. You can't tell them apart. Timing between these two 24 gigabytes of memory are really close to each other, just like maybe about a second apart, less than a second apart or so. And the M4 with less memory is actually taking that much longer, obviously, in a task like this. But if we take a look at this, timing is almost cut in half. Now, a couple things I could be attributing to that is because this is 24 gigabytes of memory. Granted, yes, that 15.7 can run on there. However, the OS also needs to use memory too. There may be some slight swapping that's happening, and if there is any swapping that's really happening on the system, this 512 gigabyte SSD is also writing at a slightly slower speed compared to the 1 terabyte SSD. And on these machines, I can tell you right now, Photoshop's not doing any swapping on the 36 for sure when it comes to this file size. We're going to see this exaggerated a little bit more in the Photoshop large test, but for now, these are the rest of the machine in the lineup for comparison, and this is the Photoshop huge. Again, we can see that 48 is really pulling out ahead of 36. The 224 gigabyte one are performing very similar to each other, and this is where it really goes in and right to the SSD, and having 512 is definitely not enough to start out with, and also the SSD writes slightly slower. This is where we start to see the effect of it, but in all these tests, I'm talking about SSD speed, in all these tests, this is probably the first one, or maybe like the second one, that shows an exaggerated result, but this is also a 56 gigabyte file. So if you work with these large files all the time, and there are some that do, by the way, for those of you that ask that question, but if you work with these files all the time, definitely just upgrade your computer. You shouldn't be running a base configuration anyway. And here's the timing for the Mac Mini M4, which I would probably say is actually, you know, holding on just fine comparing to the rest. The rest of the machine lineup for comparison. And I'm also going to share with you from Pujabent results, because what we can do then is also add in the X18. Pujabent just show a cascading scale, something that really makes sense. We're talking about a 3,002 or close to about like a 3,000 point roughly apart between the base versus the top, and we're looking at a $2,000 or $2,400 price variation. So that's something to think about. Sweet spot still there. The M4 Pro top spec configuration in a 16-inch tends to do fairly well on those. Here's the rest of the Photoshop for the lineup for you to do a comparison. And now let's take a look at the encoder-decoder engine. When it comes to this, I already mentioned this in so many previous videos that the Macs have doubled the encoder-decoder engine, which is the reason why we're seeing the time cut in half. And this generation M4, the encoder-decoder engine is also slightly faster than the M1 to M3 generation 2. This is the argument that I'm making, that even if you're a video pro and you don't really care about export time, that these encoder-decoder is going to help with transcoding files a lot more. So it might be something to consider, because you can save a considerable amount of time getting the Mac Silicon. You can see that right now in H.265 HEVC. Timing is almost double on the Pro Silicon. And here's the rest. You can really group them by just the generation of machines right there, or just the family of machine, from the regular to the pros to the Macs and so forth. All right, ProRes 422 export, you can see that timing are identical on those. Similar encoder-decoder engine numbers between all of these. That's the number you can really expect there. And now let's take a look at AfterEffects. This is using Adobe Benchmark. So for this is using a CPU and not GPU. Again, using GPU causes some color artifacting, posterization, which is the reason why Adobe went back and used CPU on this one. Talk about bandwidth like saturation, right? We're not even using all of the things yet. The other thing too is that when you run this on CPU, timing improve a little bit, not by much. But we can see how these are cascading. I mean, time variation between these are like less than a minute. This is about, what? Less than a minute. Here's also less than a minute. I mean, we can see time variation, not that much for a pretty significant price increase. And I will argue that if you're not doing this day in, day out, I mean, the M4 is actually a pretty good option too, as you're seeing there, as much as I may not be advocating for it. Here's the rest of the machine for AfterEffects Export. Premiere Pro, this is using Puget Bench. And if we take a look at the result here, we are taking a look at 3,700 to 9,190. Quite a significant margin there. I would feel more comfortable being somewhere around in this range. I mean, this range is really not bad, but we're talking about a huge price increase for us to really get there. So that's something to think about too. Premiere Pro with the rest of the machine. And lastly, we're going to take a look at DaVinci Resolve. Again, result for this is very similar to Premiere Pro. Numbers might be slightly different, but the way how they're scaling these two or clustering together, these two are coming a little bit closer, this is trailing behind, makes a lot of sense, and they're very similar to each other. Here's the rest of those. Now, the other thing that I do want to point out is that when it comes to like these top-end machines, for example, these two and these two, the variation between you doing the edit and you using it, you're probably not going to notice it as much. All right. So now you know the comparison between all of the M4 generation laptop from the M4 to two variants of the Pro, the two variants of the Mac. What's our thought on all of this? You may be wondering which one to choose. I would argue that based on the result I'm seeing right now, and if you're taking a look at a price per Performa, I would probably say that the mid-tier, right? The M4 Pro, the top spec, is a really, really good one to go by. And one thing that you can definitely do is upgrade to 48 gigabytes of memory. And I think that machine is definitely going to run, if not scream, at some of the tasks you throw at it that's using memory on the system. So if yours is coming into the Mac, as usual, my advice is if you can find an M3 generation at a really great price, at a really good discount, considering that, I would probably say, yeah, maybe choose M3. I probably would not look at the M2. I probably would not look at the M1. Unless you're not really doing this professionally, then I would say those may be great options. But M4 is a really great silicon for you to go into, and I think it's one of the generational leaps that I've been kind of waiting for like since the M1, and I'm really excited about this. As far as upgraders, if you have an M3, just keep it. Unless you need to upgrade your RAM, your SSD, or you really want a faster machine, or you want the latest and greatest, then by all means go buy these. But a practical answer is if you have M3, don't worry about it. If you have M2 generation, you can probably stretch it out to the M5, especially if you have the Max and so forth. If you have the M1, I'm going to say this. I would start looking into these new generation machines, especially like the M4. If you have the M1 Max, you may be able to stretch to like the M5, but the M1 Pro, they're starting to really like trail behind. That's my personal thought on that one. And if you already upgrade the memory on your M1 Max, I would probably say maybe keep it a little bit longer. You probably can stretch it out to the M5. That's my advice. And here's a list of upgrade priorities as a reminder. Start out with the amount of memory you want on your system. From there, it's going to really tell you which silicon you can really go into, or the chip family, whether that is the Pro, Max, etc. Then afterwards, choose the SSD storage size, and lastly, the chip variants. If you have extra funding left, you want to go and upgrade the silicon for the extra CPU, GPU cores, you can certainly do that, but I don't think you're going to see that huge of an improvement. Now, what we've seen in this test is a comparison between all of these generation machines, and one thing that I will say is that the top M4 Pro silicon, which on a 14-inch laptop is a $200 upgrade, seems to be a really great performer. But one of the things though is that on the 16-inch model, you can't really go and choose the silicon for the Pro. It just comes with one variant. Here's the point, or here's my point. If you're choosing the 14-inch model, I would argue that if you go with the base 14, upgrade to 48 gigabytes of memory, you're going to get a much better performance from that, even though you're spending like, $400 versus $200 for a silicon upgrade, rather than upgrading silicon itself. That's my personal opinion on that one. But if you have the 14-inch one and you want to send me any of those variants to test, do feel free to reach out. I would love to test those. All right, here's the recommendation that I have based on the application, and I made some changes this time around. So M4 Pro is now considered to be in the category, rank up there with the M4 Max, because I think the top M4 Pro spec, based on the current apps that we have today, is performing fairly well, right? It's hard to really argue against that. When it comes to Photoshop, if you take a look at the numbers, amazingly enough, the M3 generation, both Pro and Max, still doing really well. M4 Pro is doing okay. I mean, it's still a better machine, but I would argue that the previous generation is still doing and performing fairly well in the Photoshop test. So I would highly encourage you to go back and take a look at the result. M4 Max, obviously really good for Photoshop for that one. Now, when it comes to Capture One, interesting enough, seeing the performance of this, I would probably say like the M4 and the M4 Max are pretty much neck to neck. In fact, this is probably my new recommendation this time around for Capture One. If the only thing you do is Capture One, I would probably say just choose the M4 Pro and just get the top specs and just save yourself the money. Don't even get the Max. That's kind of where it really comes down to. If that is your primary app and your primary usage. However, if you start to do other things too, like videos and so forth, then Max may be a better option. When it comes to video, my thought is Pro will do okay. If you really want to get the best performance out of everything, I would look into the Max Silicon because that can be more demanding. As far as the amount of memory goes, it started out at 16 on the M4. On the M4 Pro, it starts out at 24, and the Max started out at 36 or 48, and I think those are really just great amount to start out with. Now, if you're getting the base one and you're doing a lot of heavy work, I might go in and bump the 16 to 24 or like 32, and on the Pro, the M4 Pro, I might actually bump that up to like 48. So those are things I might consider. As far as SSD go, 512 would probably be the minimum I would go with. Personally, I would recommend getting 1 terabyte because it just lasts longer, speed's a little bit better. This is where I was like, yeah, you know, we're gonna throw in speed into the equation as much as I advocate against speed, but 1 terabyte is definitely gonna last you much longer in so many different regards. And lastly, here's the upgraded chart if you want to really pick the silicon you're on and really upgrade it. One of the things though is that I would probably say, and someone did mention this in the comment too, that if we upgrade the M4 Max to the max amount of memory, it'll probably give the M2 Ultra really a run for the money. And in many cases, it'll probably beat it out like hands down. I would probably say so, but I think I'm going to say this. I think the M2 Ultra is still going to hold its own just fine for that one. But yeah, it's very interesting how close it is and how much of a powerful laptop we can really take on the road with us. So that is a look at the entire M4 generation MacBook Pro, from the M4 to the M4 Pro to the M4 Max, all the silicon variation. And I think a couple of strong winner really comes out. The 16-inch MacBook Pro, M4 Pro, that will be the top M4 Pro silicon, is performing really well. I think the one thing that will put that computer over the top is to upgrade the memory from 24 stock to 48 gigabytes of memory. Granted, yes, you are paying $400 for that, and you are now within a $600 price delta of the Max, but I think you're gonna get a really great performer. And overall, what we've seen so far is that, yeah, there is a jump to get to the Max, but we're not really seeing those performance jump that we really want to in the Max Silicon this time around. And Mac also have another lock-in too. So if you get the base Max, you're stuck with 36 gigabytes of memory. You want more, you have to upgrade. A $500 upgrade, meaning that you have to upgrade both the silicon for $200 and memory for $300 to get to 48 gigabyte in order for you to unlock all the other memories in this lineup. So Max is kind of limiting. I'm hoping that, by the way, when they release the M4 Ultra, we're not going to see that kind of lock-in, but I have a feeling we might be seeing it this time around. Anyway, just some of the thoughts that I have. Lots of information to cover here. Hopefully you find this helpful. Questions or comment, please leave them. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you're new. I'm Art, and I thank you for your time.